Paul George, man. The guy just came off of being one of the biggest memes in the NBA. As last year, Paul George turned into one of the worst players that I have ever seen. As this man was shooting Bob Cousy type of efficiency. And then we all know what happened in the second round. They choked, blow a 3-1 lead to the Bubble Nuggets. Him and Kawhi plays like shit. And now this season, Paul George says, I'm on motherfuckers' asses. This is revenge season. And Paul George, he's starting to make it look like a statement. As yesterday, Paul George dropped 41 points and saved the Clippers from being eliminated from the Western Conference Finals. As the Suns, they had a golden opportunity to take down the Clippers even without Kawhi Leonard. But Paul George says, give me the ball and get the hell out my way. And that's exactly what he did. As Paul George proved that he could step up in those big moments. As Paul George dropped the 41 points to save the Clippers this season. But before I get started with this video, make sure y'all like, subscribe to my channel, hit that bell for notifications. Make sure y'all follow me on Instagram. My links are down below in the description box. And let's get started with this video about, does Paul George deserves your respect? And he's proven his doubters wrong. As coming in this season, last year, Paul George, man, I could not explain this guy, because Paul George in the playoffs, man, Paul George was looking like one of the worst players that I have ever seen, man, from a superstar. Because when PG's at his best, he's like a top 10 player in my opinion. But last year, Paul George in the playoffs played like the 40th best player in the league. Because against the Dallas Mavericks, Paul George was awful. Like, especially in games 2 for 4, as this man shot 21% from the field. 21% from the field and only averaged 11 points per game. And they lost 2 of those games, but they came through thanks to Kawhi's perfect performance in the series. But Paul George, man, I cannot explain what this guy was doing. And then when we go to the second round against the Denver Nuggets, sure, he had some good games, but he also had some bad games, especially in the second half where he didn't show up. And then we all know what happened in Game 7. Paul George only dropped 10 points on 4 of 16 shooting. Kawhi Leonard dropped 14 points on 6 of 22 shooting. And they both combined for 24 points. And they obviously lost and blew a 3-1 lead. As those two, I don't know what the hell was on their minds, but it was not in the right place, especially for Paul George. Because he has a history of doing this shit. Let's not forget, he choked against the Utah Jazz in Game 6 and got absolutely owned by Joe Ingles. And then he also had some bad games with the Pacers as they got blown out in Game 7 against the Miami Heat. As Paul George, he has a history of doing this shit. Kawhi Leonard doesn't. And if Paul George doesn't get his shit together to come this year, man, those playoff P jokes are going nowhere. And then he went into the press conference, made all these excuses. Then he want to drop these middle school ass quotes. And he want to say he's no James Harden. What type of stuff is on your mind? That's why I think Paul George, he's not really mentally focused on the game. Like, he doesn't have that mentality. That's why Jared Dudley called you out, because you don't have that killer in you. And then he want to go to the press conference and say this.
But I think internally, we've always felt this is not a championship or bust year for us.
Straight up capped. He capped. He lied. He said they didn't feel like this was a championship or bust year. Dude, you lied. You capped. And that was kind of a soft comment, PG. Because I never seen nobody said that they didn't feel like this was a championship or bust, especially with the expectations that were handed to you. And now coming into this season, we don't give a damn if Paul George averages 50 points per game. He could go out there and drop 100 points, and we still won't care, because we have to see you get it done in the postseason. Because Paul George, sure, he has some good games, but mostly had bad games and doesn't show up in those big moments. And Paul George this season, he had a really good year as he averaged 24 points and had one of the best shooting splits of his entire career, as Paul George is looking like an MVP candidate, and the Clippers won 44 games as they were fourth in the Western as fourth in the Western Conference. And Paul George, he was voted to another All-Star appearance. And Paul George, man, he had an efficient year. Even one time where he was shooting 50, 40, 90, and people really thought, hey, is Paul George back? Can Paul George finally show up in the playoffs? But we have to see it to believe it, because Paul George, he hasn't shown us yet. Sure, Paul George has some wins, but he doesn't really show up in those big moments, because we all seen them in Indiana. We all seen them in OKC. And we seen it last year with the Clippers, as Paul George, in the biggest of moments, doesn't show up. And he relies on everybody else. And now that's why this season, we don't care what Paul George does. Sure, he had a great year, but most people did not give a fuck, because we have to see you get it done in the playoffs. Because if you go out there and have another great regular season and they go into the playoffs and play like shit, yeah, we're not handing that out. But against the Dallas Mavericks, sure, the Clippers lost their first two games at home, and Paul George, he had some bad games, but he still played solid, as he averaged 23 points, and they obviously won the series in 7 games, as Paul George stepped up in some of those big moments. And then when we go to the Utah Jazz series, as Kawhi Leonard went down in Game 4 with a knee injury, and people was like, shit, the Clippers, they're going to get bounced in the second round yet again, because we all know that Paul George doesn't have that dog in him. He's not mentally focused. But Paul George was like, man, I'm going to show you how mentally focused I am. As Paul George in Game 5 dropped 37 points and grabbed 16 boards. 16 boards. Had more rebounds than Rudy Gobert and exposed his ass. Pause. He exposed Rudy Gobert as the fraud that he was, alongside Terrence Mann and Reggie Jackson. As the Clippers, they rallied back and beat the Utah Jazz in Game 5. And then when we go to Game 6, the Clippers, they started off slow, as the Utah Jazz led by 25 points. And people really thought that the Clippers season was over, because if they go back to Utah, yeah, it's over. But Paul George and Terrence Mann and Reggie Jackson, a couple of other role players, decided to step up, and they took Game 6 while being down 25 points. And they eventually won the game, as they advanced their first ever Western Conference Finals in their franchise's history, I might add. And now in the series against the Phoenix Suns, Paul George, he kind of did have some streaky moments, as in Game 2 he missed 2 key free throws that would have put him up, but he missed them both, and that led to DeAndre Ayton's game winner. But Paul George, he's still playing solid in this series, as sure he's not shooting the best at the free throw line. But Paul George, he's shown that in the biggest of moments, he could step up. And now we just seen it yesterday, as Paul George dropped 41 points. And he shows that he can step up in those big moments, even with the team's best player, Kawhi Leonard, that is out with a knee injury. And people said, yeah, Paul George, he's not going to carry this team. He's going to be the same Paul George and plays like shit. And it doesn't matter if he's the number 1 or the number 2 option. He's still not going to play well. And Paul George said, shut up, give me the ball, and get the hell out my way. As Paul George in the second half of Game 5 shot 83% from the field. 83% from the field. That man was hella efficient in that second half. And sure, it wasn't just him. Reggie Jackson also stepped up. Marcus Morris stepped up. Even DeMarcus Cousins stepped up in some of those moments. But Paul George was the biggest story of this game. And Paul George, he's showing that he wants respect. As sure, we criticized Paul George a lot, especially from last year. As a basketball reference, not like personal criticism. I'm talking like basketball reference. Because, and for the people that's saying, and for the people that's attacking his family, sending death threats and shit, yeah, and for the people that's doing that, have no lives whatsoever. But for the people that's attacking him for a basketball statement, I can kind of agree with that because Paul George, he's really not mentally focused enough. And Paul George, he's showing that he got that killer instinct. He's showing that he's got that dog in him. And that's exactly what he's doing. As Paul George, man, I think he deserves his respect. Like, for real. Because when I talk about Trae Young deserving his respect, Paul George, I think he deserves the respect right now. And he's demanding it. But that includes this video. Make sure y'all like, subscribe to my channel. Hit that bell for notifications. And what y'all think about this video. Should the Paul George hate stop? Make sure y'all stay safe and stay healthy, y'all. This your boy Lil Trady signing out. Wash your hands. Wear a mask. Peace.